Hello and welcome to the easternKicks podcast, a regular magazine programme about East Asian film led by me, Andrew Heskins, founder and grandmaster of easternKicks.com, and James Mudge, our leading writer.
Hey-o.
Each episode we'll be taking a look at the latest films, news and festivals, often chatting to filmmakers and stars along the way. Welcome to our latest show. This time we're taking a close look at the Daimajin Trilogy with the help of easternKicks regular Phillip O'Connor.
Hey guys.
How you doing?
But before we go any further, we always have that most important question. What are you drinking this episode, James?
I'm drinking a very modestly, well no, not modestly, very cheaply priced bottle of fruity red wine, which is actually not bad. It's been chilling in the fridge and it's very, well, it's sufficiently fruity. So let's say, what's that you got there?
So this episode, once again returning to 8 Sail Brewery.
Okay.
And it is their Tears of a Clown. They've been clever with the way they spelled tears there. And it's a Red Eye IPA, 6.5%.
Very nice. Very, very colourful bottle.
How about you, Philip? You've got a very interesting looking mug there.
It's just a Hennessy with a bit of honey in it.
Interesting. What? Honey? What? Mind blown. What?
I didn't have anything to dilute it, but I was like, I have to dilute this somehow because if I try and drink Hennessy on the podcast, we won't get past the first film in the trilogy.
It'd be fine.
It'd be great.
We get to the second and third ones and it just goes a bit wacky.
Yeah.
As things
what
have
could possibly go wrong?
Exactly. Very, very little, but putting honey in there would dry, just the sugar.
Yeah, it's just a sweetener. Nothing more than that.
Oh my God. That would drive me mental drinking that. I can't handle the sugar like anyway, fair play.
Just in the booze, isn't it? Just in the booze. Sugar in the booze, nothing else.
Majin, the monster of terror. Majin, the monster of terror.
Anyway, so let's talk about these Daimajin films, shall we?
Yeah,
so they've just been released by Arrow Video. It's a limited edition free Blu-ray set.
Yep.
So where should we start, Philip, with the...
Okay, so the Daimajin films, which compose of Daimajin, Return of Daimajin and Wrath of Daimajin, there's a kind of a thing about the titles, and there are various different titles owing to interpretation of what Japanese translates into English, but that's the titles I'm running with. So these three were made in early 1966 by Daiei Films in Japan, and they were filmed simultaneously to be released at the other end of the year. Daiei Film was one of those studios that was formed in the post-war period. They kind of formed the big three. So there was Toho, Toei, and Daiei. And Daiei, a lot of their bread and butter at the time was period drama films, samurai and the Warring States stuff. But in the mid-1960s, head of studio Masaichi Nagata hit upon the idea of, well, Toho have their giant nuclear-powered lizard Godzilla, we need to have our own. And he came up with Gamera, which is a ginormous turtle who can fly in the sky and basically attack demons. But at the same time that Gamera was being a big success, Nagata was looking to his next big thing, and he charged Daiei Kyoto, which is basically, they had different divisions to the studio. So Daiei Kyoto's head, Akinari Suzuki, he said, make me another Gamera. So Suzuki had just seen a 1936 film called The Golem by Julien Duvier, which was made in Czechoslovakia but recorded in French. And it was basically about the Jewish legend of the clay figure brought to life to destroy mankind kind of thing, or the enemies of whoever brought it to life. And he thought, I can do that, but I can do it with Japan. So he went looking for a hook, and what he came to was he didn't want to use traditional Japanese gods, because a lot of the gods are, as Arrow notes in their booklet, uncinematic in their depiction. They're overweight or balding, they're not heroic looking and they're not monstrous looking. So he was looking for his in, and he came across a bunch of figures called Haniwa, and these are from the earlier period in Japan, before the imperial line started, and they're basically just clay statues of warriors with no face, and they're basically meant to protect a circle around a shrine. And he said, well, I'll use that. And he charged his production team, okay, come up with a storyline, come up with a plot, make sure you have everything you need. The other thing we should mention is that Dai were a studio that spent an awful lot of money on their productions, to the detriment of the studio. So Nagata was told that it would cost 10 million yen, which I worked it out to be, it's several hundred thousand, but I'm working off 1966 prices. And in it, he was told, oh, it's going to cost 10 million. He didn't wince. He just gave them the 10 million yen and off they went. The films themselves, even though they were filmed simultaneously, were released separately because you couldn't, like, this is before the whole idea of a shared universe or the MCU or any of that. So all these films were staggered out over the year. I don't know, like, there's no real point in talking about the plot of a Daimajin film because they're often the same.
Yeah, very much.
But we can cover it once, I guess. Can't we?
Yeah.
Okay, so in essence, the film is usually set in the warring periods of Japan, which is about the 1600s, thereabouts. And in it, it was usually depicted as a village somewhere in the mainland of Japan, around the Kyoto, Osaka area. It's never actually nailed down in any of the films because everywhere that they come up with in the plot is a fictional place. So we never know where we're actually set, but ostensibly we're in the mainland of Japan. And in it, the local villagers pray to a god. In this case, it's Daimajin. And it usually happens that someone comes along, either takes control of the local area or invades the area, and then purposely goes out of their way to destroy a god. In other words, the clay statue of Daimajin, because it's either giving the people hope against the occupation, or it's distracting them, or it's doing something else. The minions who are sent up usually attack Daimajin, and within several seconds they are instantly killed by the mountainside. And then the film is basically a countdown for about another 15 to 20 minutes as we realize the monster is going to awaken, it's going to come down the mountainside, and it's going to murder everyone in its path, which happens to be the bad guys.
That's pretty, very fair summary from what I've seen of the first two films. And it's always kind of the last 15 minutes or so of it, which is kind of what surprised me about the film. I mean, I must admit, I'd probably seen pictures of old Daimajin, many years ago, but I don't think I'd seen the film. So, just going by, other things we've covered on the podcast, whether it's like Gamera, Godzilla and stuff, I was expecting this to be more of a full-on sort of Kaiju, destruction type film, whereas he only comes in right at the very end and stuff, and the rest of the films are much more taken up with the actual, an actual plot of sorts and everything. I mean, the same plot each time, but there is, they're quite different to what I expected.
So in each film, the producers and the writers are playing fast and loose with mythology. For example, while Daimajin is kind of an avatar of a Shinto god, it's based upon an earlier period in Japan. It's a period in Japanese history where scholars have tried to link it to the Imperial Japanese line, so therefore giving them an unbroken, 2,000 years of imperial rule.
Yeah.
But the basic nuts and bolts of it is there is a mention in a Chinese journal from thousands of years ago called the Kingdom of Yamatai, which is ruled over by a teenage princess in Japan. That is literally an entry point in an imperial Chinese booklet, and that's it. It's never mentioned again. So in that time period, you had a lot of god worship. So you had Majin, as they're called. And Majin kind of imbued the concept of an elemental force, fire, wind, water, that sort of thing. Daimajin in our films doesn't really have a kind of a power. He's more or less told to be the god of the mountain. Now, though, I will say that the first film is different from these two films that go after it in that they hadn't quite figured out the formula to Daimajin, because they were, it's the very first film. It was the very first thing to be produced. But there's a lot more elements to the first film, where it's not a criticism of the second and third movies, but I find the first film more interesting in that it plays a bit more with mythology. So it kind of layers things on. There's Shintoism, there's Buddhism, there's imperialism, there's callbacks to prehistory in Japan. There's elements of Christian persecution, but for me, the first film is kind of like the most interesting of the lot. Not just because it's the one that sets out the formula for the other two movies, but it's also the one that has the most interesting plot line. The second and third films I do love dearly, but it's more to do with the fact of they seem to be getting away with a lot more fun. They're killing a lot more people, because like the amount of villagers who are murdered in the second film is catastrophic. Like the main kind of daimo who has taken over that area, I don't like. He's ostensibly supposed to be building some sort of battlement that will let him lob. I'm not kidding you. This is the actual plot line of the second movie. He's building a giant cannon so he can fire it at other kingdoms nearby. And the thing is, he's killing his slave labor faster than he can build his cannon. I don't think he actually gets the cannon finished at the end of the film, because Daimajin comes along and does a lot of property damage, so we never get to see the cannon in action. It's one of those things where, taken as a whole, as we've mentioned, the plot is kind of repetitive, but it's the little intricate bits which I'd like to go into later, because there's so much material. I actually didn't realize there was that much material to the movie. I saw this film as kind of like, oh, it's a kaiju film where the film takes 3/4 of the runtime to get the kaiju to turn up. But the more I watched it, the more I listened to some of the special features, and the more I read up on it, the more intricate the film becomes in terms of its construction. But ostensibly, I like the fact that while the plotline doesn't change, the elements that make up each film are subtle and they're different. So the first film kind of deals with it's essentially a palace intrigue which has a monster at the end of it. And for me, the palace intrigue is basically there's a coup, the good lord, the benevolent one, the guy who lets the villagers do whatever they want, he gets murdered, and his son and daughter get spirited away to a shrine near the god's statue. And meanwhile, our usurper has been grounding the local people into a paste, and what actually triggers it is the local priestess who's been minding the two kids for the period of time that the film spans tries.
Yeah, that's a sort of 10 year interval.
Yeah, it's literally like 10 years later. And everyone's grown up.
They've grown up. They're about 30 years older. How'd that happen?
Yeah. She kind of ostensibly tries to warn the now guy in charge, look, don't do this. Please don't anger the god. And of course, he takes that as a red rag to a bull and says, okay, go off and destroy everything now, please. And the first film, it's if you remove Daimajin, you would be left with a Daigeki period film, as I said earlier on. It's just a political intrigue. There are people being cut down. So this kind of would feel more of a kind of a Nikatsu cinema of the 60s kind of period drama where people are being cut up. Now, I want to point something out. These films were kind of watched by a teenage to young audience. The amount of people who are killed in the first film on screen is kind of catastrophic. And I'm kind of sitting there going, I can't imagine what a parent would be thinking going into this in 1966. I'm assuming that they enjoyed it because they went back to the second and third film. For the second film kind of deals more, as I said, it's more of an army invades a local area to take over a more prosperous region. And in the center of it is an island where the god lives. And this is where, as I was saying, the film starts to play fast and loose with kind of mythology, because you essentially have a prehistorical god on an island surrounded by Shinto shrines, but there's a Buddhist Bosu bell at the top of the temple. So the film never makes any kind of implication as to, well, are they just muddling it together? The film is just presupposed that this is how the local villagers believe things to go, and this is how they believe the god protects them. The second film, I find, is a bit more action-packed. There's a lot more death and destruction, and for my money, while the first film is my favourite one, the second film you can clearly see the canvas starting to open up. You see a lot more people involved. The other thing is that the second film the first film makes kind of an overt reference to the suppression of religion. In this case, it's Shintoism, but like if you've studied any of the warring periods, there is a period during the I believe it's the Meiji era where Christianity was basically suppressed and ejected from Japan, and people were, imprisoned, killed, and what have you. Whereas in the second film, the overt use of Christian iconography is much more defined. It's way more implicit. There's a main character called Lady Sayuri. She's the former lady of the kingdom that is invaded at the beginning of the film. She kind of takes on the role of the priestess role from the first film, but in this spectacular moment in the film near the end of the second half, the second third, she's crucified on a cross, completely, spread eagled with her hands out, and then put in front of a burning platform. And she kind of, it looks more like Christian iconography, like the Salem witch trials, that sort of kind of imagery. And the other thing is that in the moment where the god gets summoned, in each film, Daimajin is summoned in a different manner. In the first film, he just basically climbs out of the mountain and begins stomping down the mountain and stepping on people. In the second film, he is actually destroyed and cast into the water. Again, more religious symbology. But in the second film, he rises from the water and parts the sea, Cecil B. DeMille, Ten Commandments style, and the island splits in half, and he just basically walks his way from the island to the mainland to do battle with the invading army's forces. Again, it's one of those things where it's an implicit link between the religious aspect of the local people and the kind of pragmatic modern aspect of the samurai who've taken over in each film. But for the third film is, I have to say, one of the most different of the lot. If the first two films kind of are more about Shintoism and the relationship between the land owners and the land workers, the third film implicitly goes towards the Ainu people of North Japan, about more to do with the fact of their belief in a kind of an avatistic view of gods. Like there's the sky god, there's the mountain god, there's the ground god. So that the film still incorporates Daimajin into this, but makes it so that instead of being the lord of the mountain as he is in the first two films, he is merely a component of the mountain and works alongside the other elements of the mountain to protect the local area. The third film is also one of those films where you kind of know that it's wrapping up. They've done their production, they're winding down the trilogy, and they're getting ready to release the film. But in the third film, it's more of an adventure movie, whereas the other one is kind of straight-laced period drama, people being hacked to pieces, people being imprisoned or executed. The third film takes place with 4 kids going to rescue their parents who've been imprisoned by the local warlord to build his latest contraption and latest machinery. But the film kind of takes on a kind of a more childlike adventure where they cross the mountain, they endure hardships, and near towards the end of the film, they're at their wits' end. They've more or less run out of food, they've run out of time, they're being pursued by the warlord's people, and suddenly Daimajin, who has not been mentioned except for the fact of that's his mountain, don't go near it, he mysteriously just, it's one of those moments in the film where I kind of sat there with my hand on my cheek on, wow, you didn't see that one coming. He rises out of snow without melting it, with the body of a child in his arms going, "Who killed this child? I shall destroy these people now." It's one of those moments where, ooh, I didn't see that one coming. That was an interesting take. At the end of the film, it's one of those endings where the order has been restored, the bad guys have been defeated, the people are happy. But I found that the ending of the third movie is kind of a letdown. It just ends, it's just, Daimajin has killed everyone, and now Daimajin is going away, and everyone's happy. And it just ends, whereas the second film has a more layered ending to it, and the first film has a more conclusive, more psychologically deep ending where Daimajin is appeased and goes away, rather than he completes his task, so to speak, and goes away. So, taken as a whole, as a trilogy, the films themselves, I kind of like their each individual intent. You could watch each and every one of them separately and not have to watch the first or the third to get it. But taken as a whole, you watch as the character of Daimajin evolves from this vengeful, angry god to this basically Godzilla-like avenger of children and animals everywhere.
Always the kids. There's always the kids. Like the kids in the cameo films,
True.
the Godzilla films.
Yeah.
Always.
No, he's a cool. I mean, even like taking the plots out of it and stuff like that. And it's very interesting to hear these details because, I didn't pick up too much of that, just when watching them. But he's a very cool, even just the look of him and everything like that. The mad face and the mask and everything, and the way he walks or just kind of stomps down like some Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers type. He just he's very. There's something just relentless in the way he goes and stuff like that, which I thought was visually very striking. When I watched them. The main design of Daimajin was done by Ryosaku Takayama, who had worked with Toho sci-fi god Eiji Tsuburaya, who designed Ultraman, Godzilla, all of those ones. He was basically given the design of the original Haniwa figurine and said, I need you to build him, but build him full size. So Takayama had to build a 4.5 meter tall, full size prop version of Daimajin. And the interesting thing about the film was that the figure of Daimajin, the full sized model, was delivered less than 3 weeks before the first film debuted in the cinema, because Daiei was different from Toho and Toei in that their film processing plant was directly on studio. So every time the director finished a rush for the day, it was instantly processed, and the very next day the director could see the footage and go, we need to change this and we need to change that. So the fact that the model was delivered 3 weeks before the premiere wasn't as worrying to them as it would have been for any other production. I imagine that if it was Toho and it was delivered 3 weeks before the film, we'd have a very different looking film. But some interesting things about the film in terms of its production for Daimajin. Daimajin, as I said, was 4.5 meters tall, and in the film he's depicted as 4.5 meters tall because the main special effects guy wanted to be able to film a figure who was big enough to cause destruction, but not so big as to be Godzilla, the size of a skyscraper and stomping on people. So the special effects team, led by Yoshiyuki Kuruda, he basically wanted a model that could be physically maneuvered on set, but then for the live action plates, he could just superimpose special effects into the background. So when this thing was delivered, there was one guy inside the model in the neck and head, and all he could move was, he could move the head up and down, left and right. He could move the neck and he could move the right hand.
The right hand could also pick up the giant stone sword. So there was one scene in I think the second film, where there's this wonderful shot of the warlords guys charging into the foreground, into the middle ground, and in the very background shot, Daimajin just simply turns around and begins to draw his sword in real time. It's a full shot in the set. I thought it was such an impressive shot. And you sit there going, well, that's 1966. That's a really good shot. But the other thing about the film was that Daiei were, as I said, were kings of excess. They spent a lot of money on their productions. But one of the other things they recognized was what works for another studio wouldn't necessarily work for them. So they had to build a massive blue screen. And when I mean massive, I mean huge. I mean, this was 11 meters tall, and it was 4.5 meters wide. It had put out 100 kilowatts of power, and it was powered by 190 iodine bulbs. So our main hero in the mask was under something like 45 to 50 degrees of heat, and was having potato powder, coal dust, and everything else thrown at him. And he was told, you cannot blink. You're not allowed to blink. So the only thing he could physically look out of from the mask was his eyes. So every time they had to take a break and go, okay, we're going to reset the camera, he had to have the mask removed, and he had to have tea bags put on his eyes to stop his eyes from flaring up. And then when they reset the shot, they went, okay, back again, and he went right back to it. But apparently he was a trooper. He absolutely was committed to the role. He'd never done the man in the suit work before, but he was totally committed to the character, to the point of he would stay in the suit for hours and hours and hours just to get the shot that they wanted. And when it was finally delivered, he had been in the suit for something like 2.5 months, 3.5 months, because the film was started in January, I believe, and it was wrapped up at around late March, early April, because the first film came out in April of 1966. So he had been in that suit for 2 or 3 months. And I know that the Godzilla team who were in those suits, they were in it for a good few weeks, but I don't think any of the Godzilla actors ever had to stay in the suit for that long.
Not for, but he does a great job. You get and it's interesting hearing about like how little he could move stuff, because it does, and also talking about the golem and everything, because he does achieve that kind of like robot like or statue like movement in a very in quite a cool way. Which again, just having assumed it was going to be a man in suit normal kaiju type thing was quite surprising, and the height was surprising as well, because I expected him to be giant. And the first couple times watching the first one, seeing him, I thought it was just maybe something was off with the scale of him, because I assumed he was going to be like a proper big bastard and stuff. But then when you get used to it, visually there are a lot of very cool shots in there.
I mean, definitely the production and the special effects. They, particularly in this version we're seeing now, they look great. They really look superb. And I mean, in the last one, particularly at the beginning, you get some really nice special effects going on as well, sort of cracking of the land and all the kind of elements kind of coming up of the kind of volcano and so on. They're really nicely. They look really great. They look absolutely superb.
Yeah, the sets were designed at a particular scale. Normally for the Godzilla films, I think that the scale is much smaller to make Godzilla look more devastating. Yeah. But in this case, as we were discussing, because he was only meant to be 4.5 meters tall, the building sets were built at a scale of 1 to 2.5, which allowed the camera people to undercrank the camera, and it made the actor in the suit version of the monster, not the full-size monster, but the guy in the suit version, when he destroyed the sets, was more ponderous. It looked like it had more energy to when he like there are multiple shots. Like one of the things that always made me laugh when I was watching the trilogy was there's always one shot of them crowding towards the main gate to lock it behind them so that he can't get in, and the next shot is of him usually putting his fist through the roof or his foot through the door. It's repeated multiple times in the trilogy. It's one of those, guys, it didn't work in the first film, what makes you think it's going to work in the second? But the footage that they shoot of him destroying the main gate and then destroying buildings around him, it's done very, very well in that you kind of can see as each panel comes apart, as every floor disintegrates around you. And then at the same time, because they were committed to filming this in a particular way, they made a decision that the director of photography and the effects team would also lens the main live action plates as well, because they felt that having the one crew together would be better for continuity, because in most films at that time they had two separate teams. One guy did the special effects shots and the other guy did the live action shots, but in this case they filmed all of it together. So you have this wonderful symbiosis between the two plates, where you'll see in the background, you'll see Daimajin and he's wrecking a roof, but in the foreground you have a full-size set of the roof with 5 or 6 guys with swords and a bow and arrow standing there trying to hide from him, and he'll suddenly turn around, spot them, put his fist forward, and then the next shot is of the roof disintegrating. So it's a really well done effect for 1966, and for when you consider the Kaiju films that were being made at the time, the level of detail for that kind of shot is actually very, very impressive.
For the production, I mean, do you know, were they actually just shot in sequence, like shoot number 1, then number 2, number 3, or
yes.
did they shoot parts out of sequence, or I'm just wondering why they chose to shoot them in that kind of back-to-back way and everything, if they were still shooting the films in sequence.
In my research, I couldn't find the definitive reason as to why they shot all of them together.
It must have saved a lot of money, and even just on reusing, I imagine, costume sets. His. The Daimajin, suit, or, the statue and stuff like that. So there must have been a lot of shared stuff. But it's just from a production point of view, just interesting, because then logically it would have made more sense not to shoot the 3 things. Because you wouldn't destroy some sets. You would maybe shoot from a back angle.
Yeah.
Then,
so
if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So looking into the details of the films, they were all separately shot. So each film had a separate director and a But that was it. The only thing that was different was the director. It was the same writer, it was the same producer, same cinematographer, same special effects team. So each director brought a different tone to each film, but continuity-wise, the films all look the same in terms of their construction ethic, the costumes. And as we mentioned before, Daiei did a lot of period drama, so their costume department had reams of costumes that they could call upon, that they would not have to wait for weeks to be designed. They could just simply pull them off the shelf and go, okay, you're a soldier, you're a lady in waiting, you're a villager, go, and do that shot.
Yeah, it's just interesting, modern, especially since they were released in a fairly short-ish period of time, like one after the other. It wasn't like they held one back for a couple of years or anything. So I just wonder how much of it was sort of made and the production was designed as some kind of, you said like specifically they were looking for, not quite Godzilla, but another one of these types of films and everything. I was just wondering if there was, this kind of production, then immediate release type plan for it, because we didn't see more of him again afterwards, did we? Like,
no,
he didn't turn up in other stuff.
No,
he didn't fight any monsters, or you go down the same route, Godzilla, Gamera, or any of the others. And we got to some pretty obscure kaiju films, in the following, 10, 20 years and stuff. So I was just wondering why he didn't. Why he didn't come back, or if this was just such a specific production, get these 3 films done, get them out. Or...
According to the paperwork, he was supposed to come back in the 1980s for a new trilogy, and that never got off the ground. And I've read such wild stories as at one point they were going to do a film in which Steven Seagal was going to be in the film.
Yeah, I saw. Yeah. I was talking to Andy about that before. I mean, and
I'm trying to imagine that film, and it doesn't work.
So who would he have played? Would he have played Daimajin himself, or who would he have? What was the? We'll never know. Just trying to imagine it. You're right.
I can't imagine him giving a stone performance like that.
No, you wouldn't want his face like masked up and everything. He'd want some, some star presence.
He like Stallone playing Judge Dredd.
Exactly. And Daimajin takes off the mask and everything and says a few words and everything of encouragement. But
plays a bit of blues as well.
Barely whispers, "I am the law," and then just goes to work on killing Daimajin. I understand
because his daughter was in the Gamera films, wasn't she?
Yes, because
I guess that's the connection.
Yeah, they were being produced at Daiei at the time, and the connection was that because his daughter was doing the Gamera films, they kind of approached him and said, "Would you like to be in Daimajin?" And apparently he was okay with it, but it just never got off the ground. Then I read that at one point they were going to do a revival in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and somehow Kevin Costner was attached to it at one point. Again, it's one of those things where you kind of don't know whether to believe that or whether it actually happened and it just never got past pre-production, because it would have been an interesting film.
The Segal one probably just funny. The Kevin Costner one, somehow that's more bizarre even. Segal's such a, well, however we describe him, like ego mad bastard type and everything, whereas Kevin Costner would have taken himself quite seriously as an actor and stuff like.
Yeah,
you know,
I mean,
so I think it would have been interesting to see how that would have played out. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin Costner until very recently when he starred as Clark Kent's dad in the Superman films.
Oh yes, yeah.
That's, I think, the first time Costner had ever done like a massive budgeted film. So for him to attach himself to something like Daimajin earlier in his career, that I tend to think the Steven Seagal story is true, and I kind of tend to think that Kevin Costner is a bit more untrue. It's kind of wish fulfillment that they wanted Kevin Costner for the role.
It's completely random wish fulfillment. But no, I agree. The Steven Seagal one probably just because of the link with his daughter, and you know he was out in Japan a lot because he thought he was some kind of samurai reincarnation and everything. So, like one of the many reincarnations he's been or hasn't been.
Yes.
So I can actually believe they probably got to some chat about it. I mean that seems believable, and it's just a shame we've been robbed of it. You know, I mean, could still happen. Seems unlikely.
One of the things I when I was researching the film, Daimajin's trilogy was released over April, August, and December of '66, and interestingly enough, the first film came as a double bill with Gamera versus Barugan. So you would go into watching Daimajin, you know, vengeful kami god, and then you would just go into a giant turtle battling an equally large kaiju. So I would imagine that was the whole idea. It was like, well, we're never going to get anyone to sit down and watch an hour and a half worth of a stone statue stomping on someone's castle, but we will get them if they come and see the giant turtle.
For sure. Were they popular? Do you know the three Daijin ones and everything? Were they compared to other ones of the time and stuff?
From what I can research, Daimajin was a success. You know, Daiei were happy with it. It wasn't nearly as successful as the Showa era Gamera films that they had made at the same period. No. But it was, it was fine and it made money. The problem was that, as I mentioned before, the studio head, Masaichi Nagata, he spent lavishly not only on film production, but he also took care of his staff. He threw massive parties for the crew and the cast. And unfortunately, as we all know, you call the tune, you got to pay the piper. And eventually, Daiei went into severe financial distress and were basically shut down in 1971. So the studio was acquired by Tokuuma Shoten, who many fans of Studio Ghibli will recognize as the studio that helped financially set up Ghibli and distributed a lot of their films in the 1980s and 1990s. The studio was eventually acquired by Kadokawa, so now it's like Kadokawa Daiei Motion Picture, and then attach about 15 other names to the studio. But
that's maybe why then we didn't get more of him and stuff. Because if it was the early 70s, then when they were taking over, then the other studios maybe just weren't as interested in doing this kind of.
When I lined up all of the timeline of the problems with the studio and the various other companies that acquired the studio, like you said, James, they kind of happen at times when there was news or there was a rumor that they were going to make another Daimajin, and then somebody acquires the studio, and then that stops.
Especially, but you've talked about the production values, production design, and stuff like that. And whatever the reason for shooting 3 films back to back, maybe this was, more of a timely and costly endeavor than some of the other kaiju things and everything. So maybe, I guess as well, like now, knowing that he's only 4.5 meters tall, he's not going to have too much chance fighting other kaijus and stuff. He's a bit wee for that, like. So
Yeah.
maybe there wasn't too much crossover.
Unless they got all three of them from each movie.
Get them all together, backing each other. Yeah, maybe some of that. Or maybe he just got some Jet Jaguar where he just grows big for no reason. I don't think people would have complained massively. But, I guess he was set in that far in the past and everything. So I don't know. It's just interesting because it does seem a bit different, to more crafted and stuff than some of the other kaiju ones. And especially after what you've been telling us, Will, these religious elements and stuff, which is interesting too. Whereas most of the other ones, are pretty straightforward, to put it that way.
Yeah. He did come back for a TV show, I think, I cannot remember if it's the late 1990s or the late 1980s, I cannot remember off the top of my head. But essentially, it was a modern retelling of the first movie, but told from a modern perspective. So the events of how he became the Mountain of the God, which are mentioned in the first film, are kind of like rapidly done in flashback for the first episode, and then Daimajin is in the real world in like then modern Tokyo for the rest of the.
That sounds good. I have not. So confused by everything.
I couldn't find any footage on YouTube. I did look for it, but either I was searching for the wrong thing, or I kept getting the film and clips from it. But I would imagine that the TV show was kind of like more like Monster of the Week. I don't think you could have a show in which every episode is Daimajin killing a local bad guy because he's oppressing the local. I don't think that would work.
No, I probably wouldn't.
But if it does speak to the sort of unsophisticated TV shows we used to have in our childhood, which would basically be the same episode.
Like Godzilla cartoon or something like that, where it was basically a different.
Fugitive,
true.
They're all, it's all basically the same story every week. It's not like there's a running.
No, that's true.
Line.
But they could have focused on more of that kind of golem aspect of it and everything like that, where you could have been brought back for different reasons, or because in the first, am I right that in the first film, like to bring him back, they have to stab something to his head, or was that the second one?
No, that's the first film.
That's the first one, because that was the same as not the same as the golem, but the golem you had to write that word. I forget what it is. You had to write the word on the forehead. As well to bring them back, so they could have gone down that route and everything, and like different people bringing him back for different schemes and everything. Like sometimes trying to trick him into doing a robbery, or everything like that. They could have had fun with it, but
it's interesting
maybe
that
in the future you never know.
It's interesting that in the first two films, the god is kind of awoken from its slumber, but by being attacked. So in the first film, as you said, James, he has a spike driven through his head, and that finally wakes him up. But in the second film, he's actually dynamited. And I mean dynamited. They pack him full to the gills with dynamite and blow him up. That's how he's awoken. But in the third film, he's not attacked. He's not damaged by the local warlords. He's brought back by the death of a child. Which, again, as I said, it kind of makes the third film stand out from the first two films in that its reasoning behind why this god operates the way that it does is totally different. Because when it moves from like the mainland area of like the Kyoto, Osaka area to northern Hokkaido, the entire intent of the monster changes completely to suit the fact that in that region it would have a totally different meaning to have that kind of god on the mountain.
No, fair. It's interesting, getting to pick up on these sort of cultural, folklore type aspects and everything. But it does give it a bit more. Does give it a bit more depth and stuff. But, I guess if they'd continued and we had seen him coming up against others and stuff, then his credentials would have been diluted gradually till he ended up the same way as Godzilla. Like, it sounds like with the third one, stuff getting kids in there is okay, but maybe he'd have been dancing with them a few films later.
The other thing I wanted to mention was all three films' score were attributed to by Akira Ifukube, whom Kaiju fans will know more famously as he's the guy who composed all of the original Showa era Godzilla films. I think he scored 9.
You can hear it as well.
So similar in places.
You can really hear that.
It's like a slowed down version in some places. It's very, very, very Godzilla.
His score is kind of, it's less kind of monster of the week kind of score, and it kind of incorporates a bit more of the elements of the Mysterians, which he worked on, which kind of like is more of a sci-fi film. But for the only kind of element that I kind of think is going like, it's kind of more like Godzilla, is Daimajin's theme itself is kind of very ponderous. It's got a lot of percussion where it kind of times itself up to the monster moving down the mountain kind of thing, as it builds up as if it's like a wave about to crash against the shore. So in that, like, he apparently, according to the behind the scenes, he set himself a task of, I don't want to make a score like Godzilla. And in the end, he ended up making a score that was kind of close to Godzilla without being Godzilla.
I think it's pretty Godzilla, to be fair. I mean, it's good. I still like it.
Yeah.
And it is a bit different to it, but it's still very, exactly like you said, like it's tiny with the sort of boom, boom footsteps and everything. And you're right, it just isn't quite as monstery, because I guess Daijiman's technically...
The other thing is, the more we're talking about this film, the more I'm convinced that the third film had a deliberate intent to kind of separate it away from the first two films, because the other thing is Ifukube's score for the third film. Ifukube grew up in Hokkaido, and he spent a lot of time listening to Ainu music from the local people who lived there, because the town that he lived in, about half the people in the town were Ainu. So he spent a lot of time listening to Ainu music. The other thing was that his older brother listened to a lot of classical music, so that's where Ifukube's kind of tastes met, and he kind of learned how to be a composer and a film composer through those two influences. But the third film score is kind of different from the other ones. They're still kind of like the Daimajin theme as he kind of starts to make his walk towards the castle. But a lot of the score is more Ainu in incorporation, because he kind of understood the brief that the people who are on this mountain are not the same as the people who are around the first two mountains, or island in case of the second film. But his score for the third film is a lot more naturalistic. It's less orchestral. It's more kind of low-key. As the children make their way across the mountain, there are these low-key moments where they talk, they laugh, they have their trials and tribulations. And then it kind of cuts back to the adults who are in the film. So it cuts back to their parents, and it's more traditional. And it cuts back to the bad guys, who are kind of more villainous in intent. So I like that Ifukube kind of, in the third film, he kind of blends the two separate universes together into a nice little kind of whole at the end of the film, where you can kind of feel that the two tones, the Ainu-inspired parts of the score and the more traditional kind of the rest of the Daimajin Trilogy music kind of meets in the middle. So at the very end of the film, you have this kind of synthesis between the two themes.
このままでは俺たち3人はここで行き倒れになってしまいます。神様、鶴吉がこの身を捧げます。どうかお怒りを鎮めてお父ちゃんや村の人たちを助けてください。よし、腕。
Oh, the other thing I forgot to mention is, if you guys pick this up, or you see it on online, or you're watching it on like a streaming platform, and you see the posters that you have the monster. So you either see the original posters, or you might see Arrow stuff. The monster has basically the armor and clothing that he wears is as close to the Haniwa statue as possible, but his mask. So basically, in this, like in every kaiju film, there's a moment where the monster powers up. So in the film, he kind of crosses his hands over his face, and when he does, it goes from being a clay mask to being kind of a kami kind of what's the other one? Kind of an ori kind of demonic mask. The other thing about the mask is, other than it's green, apparently the special effects guys were just like, I just thought he should have a green mask. No one told me to make it green. I just decided that green was a cool color, so he made it green. But the other thing was that one of the guys who was handling the special effects said that Kuruda kind of was overseeing the design, and when Takayama was building the set, the mask and what have you, he gave a cleft in the chin. And apparently it's because he'd just seen Kirk Douglas in the film, and he really liked Kirk Douglas's chin cleft.
So that's where the cleft comes from.
I must admit, that's an unexpected but very interesting bit of info, man.
It's just like
Kirk Douglas.
The other thing I wanted to mention was the films themselves. So the first film was directed by Kiyoshi Yoshida, and he's most famous for having done the Daiei Zatoichi films from the mid-60s. So he kind of when he was told, by the way, your brief is a daimyo is killed by his chamberlain and a monster gets unleashed on the chamberlain's force at the end. He kind of understood that brief and went, "Oh, okay, gotcha. I know how to do this kind of film." The second film was Kenji Misumi, and he is famous for the early Zatoichi films from Daiei, and he also directed the Lone Wolf and Cub series of films. So the second film is kind of more, it's less kind of samurai adventure, kind of cutting people down. It's more kind of brutal kind of realism. So I think he was perfect for that kind of role. And the final film was Kazuo Mori, who he has done a ton of work, but the only thing I could really find that kind of suited the bill for this kind of project was Vendetta for a Samurai, which I believe stars Toshio Mifune. And he also did tons of Daigeki genre films for Daiei in particular. So again, it seemed to me that the project itself was kind of, they drew on people who knew how to do period drama, but they also had an experienced effects team who would back them up for the more supernatural elements to the project.
But it also kind of says a lot about the pacing of these films, and that, so much of them is this the samurai period drama until you get to the end. 15 minutes, as we've said.
Well, especially since, 4.5 meters, how many people is that? He's only about 4 people tall, I guess, or something. He's not that big. Could have stopped. If they had the cannon, they could have easily stopped him.
Actually, there was a scene in the film, and I think it's the. I'm trying to. You have to remember, I watched all of these back to back last night. I watched them. I watched them earlier in the week, and then I had to watch them again for the special features. So I watched them all back to back. So just bear with me. So I think in the second film, it's my apologies. It's the third film where the local warlord is building his massive line of cannons to kill other people in other kingdoms nearby. Also, I want to find out how close you have to be in a Japanese kingdom to be able to fire a cannon, which is essentially a 16th century cannon that's going to hit them from that far away. But apparently he did. Just to go back to what you were just saying there, James, they actually turned the cannons on him at one point.
Yeah, okay.
And the film kind of makes a point throughout the trilogy that traditional weapons don't work against them.
Yeah,
one of the things I did dig up from the notes was that according to the film's production team, Daimajin is not so much a real figure, like a real 4.5 foot tall stone tablet. He's more of a spirit rather than a physical being. So when they hit him with cannons and fire, and I think they roll tree trunks down on his feet at one point, he just simply steps over all of it, or he just ignores it. Because it doesn't.
I think they do talk about that thing particularly in the first one, where it is much more about the Maijin spirit that enters him, and that actually is it's just kind of a representation of this god rather than actually being.
But if they destroyed it, then he'd probably just go and find another one and possess it. Because it's the spirit, not. Yeah, it's the same as the golem again and stuff. You're conjuring a spirit into a vessel.
Yeah, because
do stuff.
In the second film, he's actually totally destroyed. So
exactly.
So the Daimajin that kind of rises up, splits the island in half, and then parts the Red Sea kind of shot.
Yeah,
that's not actually the statue that was destroyed. That is basically his spiritual essence. So again, it's one of those things where it's less about the physical manifestation of the creature, but more about the spiritual manifestation of the creature. Again, it plays into that thing of throughout the first film and the second film, the local priestess in the first film, and then Lady Sayuri they make a point to tell the bad guys all the time that you're messing with forces that you can't possibly understand. Like the priestess in the first film, she makes a point to tell the main bad guy that you're really screwing around with something you have no control over, and you're going to die. She actually says 3 times, "You're gonna die. You're really gonna die." She gets cut up twice, falls to the ground, and she's like, "You're gonna die."
I was gonna ask you one thing. It was more of a wrap-up type question. Type one. I was gonna say, so we've got Daijin coming out. Is there any other ones kind of left which haven't kind of been released by now. And we've had so much of the
Well,
Godzilla
the
stuff. Godzilla.
Arrow have got the Yokai Monsters trilogy coming out soon, haven't they?
They do, and the other thing is that I might be wrong, but I think Daimajin makes an appearance in Great Yokai War.
The Miike one, yeah.
Yeah, but I can't tell you if it's just kind of like a significant part, or if he's just a cameo or something like that. He is supposed to apparently turn up in a yokai or kaiju movie in 2021 in Japan. He's prominently displayed on the poster, and he's more kind of like, well, we need to design a Daimajin for like the crowd that went to see the legendary Godzilla films. So he looks more, I want to say, kind of brutalizing. Like, you know, his armor is much more elaborate. The mask is huge. The helmet is massive. But I only got to see like a poster of the film, so I can't tell you anything about that project.
He might still be 4.5 meters tall. They could have bulked out the other way. Like, they bulked out Godzilla a bit. You know, he looked like he'd been, you know, not on a diet, put it that way. So maybe with Daimajin as well, he's been working out, eating too much, bit too much sake.
He's decided now that he's making his big comeback, so he's got to get into shape for his next match.
Stretching himself a bit.
The Daimajin Trilogy is available now as a limited edition 3-disc Blu-ray from Arrow Video, across various territories, I think, as a lot of their stuff is now. And absolutely jam-packed with extras, audio commentaries, booklet notes, everything, really.
Yeah.
シグ、これは何か悪いことの起こる前兆だ。あ、埼玉、危ない。
神様、私は命を召されても構いません。十郎様や兄を、千草の人々をお救いください。
But let's move on to some easternKicks picks.
Yes. Bit of a leaner time. I mean, compared to recent podcasts where we've had a lot of stuff. So I don't have a massive amount for you. But Amazon Battle Royale has been added. Not the director's cut, but then as we know, they don't always list things correctly, so it might be the director's cut. Joko Anwar's Gondala is superhero, which I still haven't watched, so I'm quite looking forward to checking that out. He's obviously mostly known for his horrors and black magic stuff, but I remember him saying that they wanted to establish some kind of like Marvel style superhero.
It's its own universe. That there are going to be a series of films. So Chemo is working on one of those.
Yeah, that's right. So
and several of that tight set of guys, the Marvel Brothers, and
exactly, man. That'll be cool. So I'm looking forward to watching that. And I also saw the Chinese queer film, like A Dog Barking at the Moon, was on Amazon, which I came across randomly.
Of course, it was random.
Of course, it's fucking Amazon, man. It's random as hell. But which our good friends at Queer East screened recently, I believe. So that's going to be. I'm going to check that out. Netflix, bizarrely, Time and Tide has landed, which we talked about in a previous past, which seems really weird timing. That's actually come not long after this.
And is that via
release? You can't tell because it's Netflix, so it doesn't say who's put it up there. So yeah, that's a slightly strange one, to be honest. Ashen of the North, which I've mentioned before, but I finally watched, like the Kingdom special. Bit pointless, but not bad. It's not bad, and hopefully that means they won't have any flashbacks when we get to Kingdom Season 3. We won't have lots of flashbacks to who she is, but it's okay. It's just not a massive amount of point to it. And there's a Thai film called Deep on there, which weirdly has 5 directors. It's like a sci-fi one about sleep experiments. No idea what there's 5 directors, but it looks quite interesting in the trailer. So yeah, and that's it. Like I say, not much this month, man.
So thanks for Philip joining us and with such enlightening knowledge about the Daimajin.
Honestly, that was fascinating because I didn't, even having a quick look at stuff around about online, I didn't pick up even half of that. So yeah, it's very cool, man.
Thank you.
I have to say thanks TJ, to Andrew especially, because I'd completely forgotten about Daimajin. Like, I'd seen the Mill Creek set. I was like, oh, I'm not going to get that because Mill Creek are terrible at their jobs. And when it came up again, I was like, oh, I should pre-order this because it's going to go out of stock like the bloody Gamera box set went out of stock.
So that's it for the episode. Don't forget you can find all of our previous episodes on Apple, Amazon Music, Spotify, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe now and you'll never miss an episode. But for now, cheers.
Cheers.